Hi, welcome to Militant Clean Capitalism. This is Josh. In this interview, I am joined by friend and special co-host Casey, where we're in conversation with Jason Moore, discussing the historical and ideological roots of contemporary environmentalism, tracing its origins to the post-Civil War era in the United States. He argues that environmentalism has historically been an elite-driven movement, often serving the interests of capitalism by promoting resource management and conservation in ways that benefit economic growth. Moore critiques the mainstream environmentalism of the 1960s and 1970s, describing it as a form of benign reformism that ultimately aligned with capitalist interests and suppressed more radical elements. Moore also addresses the role of the professional managerial class in shaping environmental discourse, particularly through the expansion of the biosecurity state and the integration of national security and big tech. He also critiques the historical and ideological underpinnings of bourgeois naturalism, which he argues has been used to justify racial and gender oppression, as well as colonial imperialism. The discussion touches on the role of foundations such as the Ford Foundation and co-opting and neutralizing radical struggles. Moore problematizes climate doomism, fear-mongering, and crisis rhetoric that have come to dominate climate change discourses. Jason Moore is an environmental historian, historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he coordinates the World Ecology Research Collective. He is the author of multiple books, including Capitalism and the Web of Life. His books and essays on environmental history, capitalism, and social theory have been internationally recognized. He frequently writes about the history of capitalism in Europe, Latin America, and the United States from the 16th century to the neoliberal era. Casey is a historian and organizer based in New York and Chicago. He focused on the politics, economy, and the connected histories in South Asia and the Middle East, specifically the Arab Gulf. His work focuses on questions of development, ecology, and political resistance, as well as connecting the global scale events to local diaspora communities within the United States. As always, if you like what we do and want to support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. Do so for as little as $1 a month. We bring you these conversations totally independently with no corporate, state, or grant funding. We're going to include a set of links in the show notes to Dr. Moore's articles that we base our conversation on. Please check those out for further information. Now, here's Jason Moore discussing some of his work. We're here today with Jason Moore, and we want to get started first by talking about an article you published in May titled "The Fear and Fix Environmentalism Serves the Powerful," where you place the origins of the dominant form of contemporary environmentalism at the end of the Civil War, where you write, and I'm quoting here, "Since the end of the Civil War, environmentalism has very much been a blue blood affair as American capitalism came under the sway of giant corporations and the demand of resources exploded. The scientific and technocratic requirements for administering public and private power grew immeasurably. In order to house the growing population, softwood lumber output alone tripled between 1865 and the turn of the century. For the first time beyond a few royal forests in Western Europe, systematic resource management became essential to capitalism. In this first wave of environmentalism, nature would have to be conserved and managed if economic growth was to proceed with it, at least a semblance of order and efficiency." That was the end of the quote. But since then, there has been periods like the 1960s that, appeared briefly as though mainstream environmentalism might chart a more radical course. So can you just speak a little bit to the history you lay out from the end of the Civil War to the turn of the century, to also the brief period between the 60s where things seem to be radicalizing a bit, but instead turn to what we term a benign reformism that was, and I'm quoting here, at odds with labor and the New Left and national liberation movements?
Benign reformism is probably the most milquetoast way of putting it, because it was, in effect, quite malign, and was environmentalism since the late 1960s has been this quasi-religious, quasi-economic, quasi-scientific amalgam of what we now call the professional managerial class, and especially its maturing across the late 60s and early 70s. They necessarily, to keep them within the limits of capitalist power and business as usual, they needed a worldview that allowed them to feel virtuous, but at the same time cut into not just the economic bargain, which they were, but also into the moral, virtuous culture of neoliberal American capitalism. Now, that story that you begin with me quoting, starting the clock on environmentalism after the Civil War, is very conventional. This is the standard view amongst historians, that there is a first wave of American environmentalism that is variously committed to the rational management of resources, called conservationism, and to the setting aside of parts of nature, parts of the web of life, to benefit supposedly all of society. That was called preservationism. Now, in practice, preservationism only set aside parts of the web of life that were not profitable at the moment. So places like Yellowstone, beautiful, also home to indigenous peoples who were expelled. The U.S. Army had a base on Yellowstone Park, but it was not economically central. It wasn't the Iron Ranges of Minnesota. It wasn't good agricultural land. It was remote. It could be preserved at little or no cost. And that's basically the story of environmentalism ever since. There's a romantic naturalism that we associate, say, with Henry David Thoreau and others, going through John Muir, that is about a kind of individualized reconnection with so-called nature, with the overcoming of alienation and the discovery of one's true, authentic self in nature, as they say. This is a classic petty bourgeois approach to the web of life. By the way, if you're thinking, oh, I like to go camping, I like to hike, and that feels good, I'm not arguing against that. I like to camp, I like to go hiking too. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this kind of quasi-scientific, quasi-religious worldview of, we might call it nature idolatry, or a particular form of modern nature worship. In any event, there's this long history of successive reinventions of environmentalism, which, as you quote from me, is and always has been a very blue blood affair, a very elite affair. And it only acquires a mass character through the counter-revolution of the late 60s for the older petty bourgeoisie and some elements of the white blue-collar white working class. Nixon's Law and Order had appeal. But for the new professionals who flirted with radicalism in the 60s and early 70s, it was a way to get them back into the centrist liberal juggernaut and to divide and keep very much apart the liberals from the radicals. So this is important to keep in mind as we move into the present politics of climate justice and invocations of climate emergency, coming out of the audacious rollback of civil liberties and the expansion of the biosecurity state during the pandemic lockdowns, all of which were fully embraced by the professional managerial class. If you were in academia, you could not even raise questions about these. If you raised questions saying, well, emergency politics have historically been very authoritarian and dangerous, you're likely to be shouted out of the room of any academic audience, where use of the term climate emergency expanded 3,500% between 2018 and 2023. That's not an exaggeration. A handful of times across the 2010s, it just became front and center to all academic discussions. Sometimes you have people maybe doing a little hand-wringing, like, state of emergency politics are maybe problematic for civil liberties, but the game is worth the candle anyway. And this is part of this invocation of nature worship, but also of savior environmentalism. That is, we're going to save nature, we're going to save the planet. And it's always this mix, and it's a way of thinking and seeing the world that goes back to Malthus, who was a minister, a curate in the English countryside in the 1790s. This weave of virtue hoarding politics, as Catherine Liu says, with good science, which is a term that should make our blood run cold if we are interested in democracy. And all of it, to summarize, translates, this is part of the argument of the fear and the fix, translates into a contempt for working people and a contempt for democracy. That characterizes environmentalism today.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that. You mentioned something that I really want to talk about with you, which is like the massive expansion of the biosecurity complex and its surveillance technocratic apparatus since 2020. And also, if so, you can say a word about that, but also a word about the role the academy played or didn't play in that process, right? And the refusal and or the inability to speak about that from the role as an academic.
Well, the academic left completely abandoned the critique of the national security state. Let's remember that for well over half a century, we could go back to Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers and the revealing of Rand's war planning, and we could go back even farther than that. But for over half a century, the left, including the liberal left, was a critic of the national security state. Think of the critique of counterintelligence programs led by the FBI against the Black Panthers, COINTELPRO, or the revelations of the Frank Church Committee in the mid 1970s about CIA operations abroad, and drawing the work of people like Phil Iggy, an ex CIA agent, and also the critique of the police state at home, of the FBI as a domestic political service. And of course, this continues with the Snowden revelations and the critique of post 9/11 national security state. All of that was thrown out the window when the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, even when some people like Naomi Klein started to talk about the pandemic shock doctrine, they immediately backed off and wouldn't touch these issues that COVID came from nature. It was going to kill everyone. All of these lockdown and biosecurity procedures were absolutely necessary because we faced an existential threat. Underlying it all is the fear of nature with an uppercase N, something I've spent the past 25 years of my life trying to communicate to somebody. When the ruling class and powerful people start talking about nature, natural laws, run. Those arguments have always been weaponized against the working class and used to paint all of the producing classes and the reproducing classes, peasants, women, indigenous peoples, everyone, as wild, as savage, as undeveloped, as outside of the virtue and knowledge of civilized and scientific man. This has a very, very long history. This mention of climate emergency that I made in response to the last question essentially primed the pump for the professional managerial class's acceptance of the official COVID narrative and the acceptance of the massive expansion of the biosecurity state, the limiting of liability for big pharma, the integration, as we know, of the national security state and big tech. They were always tightly integrated, but now we've seen it. Everybody who wants to can go and read the Twitter files. This is not even empirically connected. The recent court case that came down found the Biden administration guilty of violating the First Amendment, acting to stop the spread of, quote, misinformation or disinformation, information that they didn't want the public to hear. Even information that was deemed as true was shadow banned and downgraded in the interest of a remarkable expansion of the biosecurity state in the name of COVID. And so in that sense, although COVID and the climate crisis are very different geophysical phenomena, the ruling class playbook continues to go back to a mass politics of fear and the fear of what? Above all, the fear of nature, of the wild, of the death that will come to us through nature, right? Climate change is, we are told, an existential threat. It is a very serious threat, but existential threat has a very specific meaning that's related to doomism and the politics of climate emergency, COVID emergency, so on and so forth. So there's this very, very serious moment we are living through in the history of capitalism right now around these questions.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. I kind of want to take it back a little bit to what we were talking about before, about like the kind of disruption and cooptation of the environmentalist struggles in the 60s. There's a lot of literature out there that highlights how the Ford Foundation in particular in their funding efforts have helped disrupt, co-opt, liberalize, and destabilize radical political struggles. I'm thinking about specifically the civil rights and Black Power era, how Robert L. Allen, for example, pays close attention to this in his magnum opus, Black Awakening in Capitalist America, and documenting how successful they were in this cooptation. But you also make note of this in your article, highlighting that the Ford Foundation, and I'm quoting here, of efforts to tamp down the radical elements of the movement, end quote. So can you discuss this in detail, how they have been able to do this successfully?
Well, you're absolutely right, of course, that the Ford Foundation from 1964 onwards mobilizes the techniques of the cultural Cold War, the anti-communist cultural Cold War in Western Europe, and brings it home. And first and foremost, it sets in its targets any working class African-American movement. So the great fear was a replay of the 1930s when the Communist Party and allies forged a multiracial working class unity. In that light, the Ford Foundation's push to develop a nonprofit industrial complex, or race relations, Black capitalism kind of politics, has to be seen as a form of cultural counterinsurgency, bringing the cultural Cold War home. An analogous process with less money, because it was much easier to do, but an analogous process occurred with the Ford Foundation, the Rockefellers as well, but Ford was like the Gates Foundation of our era. Ford was the big player on the block. Ford puts into business almost overnight, between 1967 and 1973 major legal defense firms, the Environmental Defense Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council with Gus Speth, who was later Carter's advisor, and then the dean of Yale School of Environment, or it might still have been called Forestry at the time, and the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, which I think is now called Earth Care or something to that effect. In any event, you see a parallel movement that is exactly the same script, with the figure of Ed Yonacone, who is still alive. Ed Yonacone is a very, very interesting figure in the story. For those who've read Naomi Klein's book on the climate crisis, he figures prominently. He's the fellow who coined the phrase, sue the bastards. And this is not a left-wing strategy, by the way, but he was a militant public interest lawyer and was key to the formation of the Environmental Defense Fund. To make a long story short, Yonacone took his business too seriously, and he wanted to engage in massive class action suits against the use of DDT in the late 1960s. It freaked out the Ford Foundation. Ford said, no, our subsequent actions, basically saying Ed's got to go, said, no, that had nothing to do with his politics. But as Sabin, the historian Paul Sabin has pointed out, in the archives, it's very clear that Ford Foundation saw Yonacone directly and personally as a threat. So what happened was very interesting. Not only did the Ford Foundation enforce a professionalization, so-called, of these and countless other environmental groups that it funded, but it installed a 5-member panel of former presidents of the American Bar Association from both parties to approve any litigation, any major litigation that Ford Foundation funded law firms took on. So this was in 1969 and 1970. So when we get this story that Naomi Klein gives us, that, well, there was a golden age of environmentalism and it was about polluter pays and holding corporations to account, that's not true. She's just got that wrong. I love so many of the things she says, but that's just flat out wrong. And that the major victories resemble this. And there's a very compressed version of the story in the article. There will be more coming out over the next year in various forms, including a book. But DDT was already on the way out. As early as 1965 and 66, it was being phased out in agriculture. There were low-cost, cheap substitutes in agriculture in the form of organophosphates. And so the Environmental Defense Fund, yes, did succeed, if you want to put it that way, in convincing the EPA to institute a ban on DDT, I think, which goes into full effect by 1972. but it was already on the way out. It was costless. It was cheap. Business had no expenses to bear from it. In that sense, that's a story that's repeated itself many times. If we look at, for instance, the Montreal Protocol around ozone depletion, it's the same story. This is a story of how environmentalism claims victories that are, in every major case, costless to capital. And that's part of the story of the environmentalism of the rich, a term that we get from Johann Martinez-Allier. But the environmentalism of the rich is part of ruling class consciousness. In a lot of ways, it's the glue that holds ruling class consciousness together, not just since the 60s, not just since the Civil War, but from the very beginnings of capitalism, certainly from the later 16th century. The story of Malthusianism is another good example of this, that nature is the go-to ideological cement for convincing the rest of us that the ruling class knows what it's doing and will bring us development. Well, now it won't bring us development. It doesn't promise us development anymore. It promises us that we won't die. Trust us. We know the science. We know that we can manage the problem. This is Justin Trudeau, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, countless others. We can manage this. We can science away the problems. And this is very much the strategy of not just the biosecurity complex around COVID, but also the planetary management complex around addressing the climate crisis.
I guess I'd like you to elaborate more on your point on climate doomism and the invocation of crisis logic generally. You have a pretty great critique of general pessimism and fear-mongering at the end of your article, which I think it's important to quote at length and allow you to elaborate on or speak to further. You write, and I quote, "We are living with the results of these insufficient efforts, a tepid environmentalism captured by elite interests and premised on a Janus-faced worldview. Let's call those faces the fear and the fix. On one hand, there's a long thread of doomist thinking fixated on the metaphor of survival. When Biden told the nation in 2023 that the climate crisis is an existential threat, he was recycling an old trope. Since the 1970s, it's amounted to a kind of emotional blackmail on a world scale couched in the rhetoric of technoscientific realism. Notwithstanding its ubiquity, existential threat rhetoric has little to do with confronting the forces behind the planetary inferno. Indeed, it might enable those forces. Put simply, climate doomism is not about climate. It's about cultivating a climate of fear and the imperative of a technoscientific fix to the tipping points remaking the biosphere. Geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, electric vehicles, renewable energy, climate-smart agriculture, you know the list. And it's not that we won't need new technologies to address the climate crisis, but without the necessary connection to the democratization of today's structures of power and profit, such fixes will never be anything but authoritarian," end quote.
Yeah, it's rather frightening when we encounter arguments about existential threat, climate existential threat, climate doomism, eco-catastrophism, all part of an effort to suppress and quiet democratic ferment from below. This is, in my view, one of the reasons why climate emergency, existential threat, and other eco-catastrophist rhetoric has gained such traction on the left as well as the center over the past decade. What the neoliberal masters of the universe succeeded in doing in the 70s and 80s was cutting off the head of the world left. And sometimes quite literally, but decapitating the world left through soft power and hard power measures. And then what happened after 2010 with the great financial crisis, the Great Recession, and the Arab Spring was the kicking off of an unprecedented era in the history of humankind, an unprecedented era of social unrest and political and social action in many, many different registers, not all of them, certainly not all of them on the left. So Occupy, Arab Spring, but also populisms of the left and right, forms of so-called terrorism or armed attack on empires and states in the name of religion, fundamentalism, and all of that. You can see the incoherent politics, but also the extraordinary mass ferment that was going on. Now, one of the ways to justify an authoritarian and anti-democratic response is through recourse to, scholars have a lot of names for this, but to emergency rhetoric, to the state of exception, as Agamben says, to Schmittian politics after the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, that invocations of Western rationality, science, etc., as the way to identify the existential threat and then to justify authoritarian politics, techno-scientific politics, are the character of our times. And part of what I'm doing is to locate the longer and deeper histories of these processes, as well as to reconstruct what is the role of the environmentalism of the rich, which in the most recent half century of world history. And if you look at when great moments of Malthusian thought come into play, they come into play during moments of profound revolt and social instability. So Malthus himself, of course, writes, his first essay appears in 1798. He writes in the midst of the revolutions of the West, the Americans, the French, the Haitian, revolts everywhere, proto-socialist upheaval in the cities and the countryside of England, mass protests against food prices or food price inflation. All of these dynamics, the revolt of the Irish, which happens in 1798, just as he's completing the proofs of the first essay. So he is writing very much in the moment of popular revolt and social unrest. The same goes for about 80 years later when we get Galton's theory of eugenics. And eugenics and scientific racism appear on the scene at the time of the massive and rapid consolidation of an international multiracial proletariat, cross-border migration, both from Asia to North America and Europe to the Americas. And then again in 1968, when you have Garrett Hardin's The Tragedy of the Commons. Hardin was a eugenicist, by the way. And Paul and Ann Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which was sponsored by the Sierra Club. These appear and gain traction and influence at the moment of the high tide of world revolutionary upsurge between 60 and 74. That was the global environmental moment, in the words of the historian Yeardley Smith, who then proceeds to say, well, it had nothing to do with third world and socialist revolt. The fuck it didn't. It had everything to do with trying to put the lid back on that process. And it did so by peeling away the liberal professional managerial types who had flirted with radicalism in the 60s and early 70s, and then were brought back into centrist liberalism by the mid-1970s. These are the people who organized for and worked for people like Jimmy Carter, a right-wing warmongering candidate who came from the right wing of the Democratic Party and proceeded to launch the Second Cold War against the Soviet Union. So there's this longer and deeper history of environmentalism that we need to look at. And I want to be clear that when we talk about doomism, it's difficult sometimes in people's minds to separate out doomism as an ideological argument from an assessment of climate crisis. And of course, my view, and I'm actually one of the few people on the left who writes about climate history as more than a recent consequence of events, climate change is fundamental to the unfolding epochal crisis. That does not mean the end of human existence. If that's so, then we have to look at the long-standing political work in actually existing history of existential threat arguments. And of course, once we start to do that, we start to draw some uncomfortable parallels in the history of nation states and particular kinds of militarized nationalisms over the past century, including over the past recent period, you can see their emphasis on existential threat rhetoric is really dark and really fundamental and tends to involve, and the climate left doesn't want to deal with this, but it tends to involve, it almost structurally requires the demonization of certain human beings as subhuman. And the American version of that is Hillary Clinton and the deplorables. The American working class is Trump supporters. Some of them are good people, but about half of them, she says, are deplorables.
I guess I'd like to talk more about the politics of crisis generally. And actually, this will be about whether it's useful or not to even describe something as a crisis, and also, I guess, generally what that even means. So I guess in your framework in the essay called Global Capitalism and the Great Implosion, your framework of the Great Frontier describes the long 1970s through today as a form of epochal crisis generally, where you say the more the Great Frontier closes, the more the overaccumulation problem intensifies and the greater the 1%'s desperate mobilizations. More financialization, more surveillance, and more coercion, all of which reinforce the capitalogenic trinity: climate, class divide, apartheid, and climate patriarchy. Under the cover of the Anthropocene, the deepening biospheric crisis will be seized upon the Davos Project to pursue its tributary ambitions under the sign of saving nature. Your work I'm drawn to and interested in because, like our mutual influences, Giovanni Arrighi and Beverly Silver, you situate moments of intertwined economic and ecological crises as moments of transformative possibility on behalf of either capital or labor. And I'd like if you could tease out this concept of crisis in its epochal or legitimation or frontier crisis concept more, as we both agree that like an undialectical vision of crisis views this as just pure doom and pure existential collapse. But as Ali Qadri, another influence, says, the accumulation of waste and overproduction of waste is already inherent in the process of capital, and wasting congealed labor time, lives, and ecosystems in its wake. So I guess I want to ask, what differentiates the politics of crisis from like the politics of every day, and what makes something, I guess, is the invocation of crisis only a political tool used to justify these forms of expansion of power or not?
Well, for some, maybe. But let me ask about what is the crisis of the everyday? Does that mean simply the normal state of working people in capitalism, that it sucks?
Pretty much.
It's insecurity, yeah. It's violent, it's alienating. Okay, that makes sense. So a crisis is different from a very bad situation. We have history, and let's remember that historical analysis is one half of the philosophy of praxis. Praxis is in part the evaluation in the unfolding present, which is also a historical moment, to reevaluate theory, political strategy, and the empirical assessment of capitalism as a whole. We also do that historically. Almost all of the left, and the eco-socialist left in particular, has abandoned history as a fundamental category of Marxism and revolutionary socialism. That means that, for instance, one of the consequences is that when I go to talk about crisis before very well-educated, passionate audiences, they tend to treat claims of crisis with deep skepticism and tend to treat crisis as if it is a speculative enterprise. The theory and history of crisis is not only not a speculative enterprise for historical materialism, but fundamental to any Marxism worthy of the name. That the theory of historical crisis and class struggle and the web of life is there in Marx and Engels from the German ideology in 1845 onwards. Eco-socialism in particular tends to reject crisis theory. And it rejects crisis theory, a synthesized socio-ecological crisis theory, because its premise, and people like John Bellamy Foster have been very clear on this, that the crisis of the earth and the accumulation crisis are completely separate. And that there's, and I quote, no necessary feedback relation between the two. You can make up your mind about that, but this is part of a flight from world history, that if we come back and seek to reconstruct the history of large-scale, long-run crises, so developmental crises is what I call them, Arrighi and Silver, who are not Marxists, but consume Marxism, have a very astute sense of these developmentalist crises. Today, we face an epochal crisis, and my argument for capitalism's epochal crisis is grounded in a very simple but also very detailed and long-run set of world historical investigations. To make a very long story very short, capitalism's principal means of fixing its great accumulation crises have depended on moving to frontiers of cheap nature and securing cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials, the four cheaps, as the necessary condition for a great wave of capital accumulation. That's occurred in every great wave of every period that begins, that launches a new phase of capital accumulation. You can see this in the advent of monopoly capitalism at the end of the 19th century. You can see it in the climate and class crisis of the late 16th and into the 17th century, the long, cold 17th century. There are many, many instances of this. I spend a lot of time in Capitalism and the Web of Life going through these. There is a historical argument to be made. The eco-socialist left has completely abandoned the historical discussion of these developmentalist crises and the way they inform a reckoning of epochal crisis today. And this affects our climate, our politics quite directly. The mantra of the climate left is the capitalists can't solve the climate crisis, so therefore the climate crisis will deepen, the planet will heat up to the point where it can't support human life. And that's a problem, and I'll tell you why. Today's capitalist classes, its ruling blocks, and there are really two. They're very, very rough and ready, but one is more coherent and has a deeper history of institutional connection in the Atlantic and bringing in the Japanese, the so-called trilateral zone, and today, of course, other players. And then against it is Belt and Road, the so-called BRICS, and both have strategic visions and plans for addressing the climate crisis. And they are doing so, whether they're conscious of this or not is unclear to me, but they're doing so in an essentially a post-capitalist way. This is the effort to move towards what Samir Amin, the great critic of underdevelopment, called a tributary mode of production. That is, where politics or tribute is the principal mechanism of moving the social surplus around. And that's really the move that makes sense if we accept the reality of the climate crisis, not the existential threat rhetoric, but the reality of climate crisis, which will be politically managed and will be politically managed to in these two projects to reproduce whatever vision of class society they cook up. And this is crucial because to pretend that the forces of the transnational capitalist class aligned around Davos, to imagine that they do not have a plan to deal with the climate crisis is magical thinking. And almost all of the eco-socialist left indulges in that magical thinking. No, these are folks who have, from the early 1970s, been cooking up plans for planetary management. They used to say that out loud, like in 1974 with Richard Gardner. Now they call it something different, planetary stewardship. And note the theological overtones of that. Well, we want to find, and they come up with all of these virtuous theological, quasi-religious, quasi-scientific language like nature positive. Like, who's against nature positive? The rights of nature. And this opens the door to the populist right, the eco-socialist and left failure. The populist right is correct that that there is indeed a globalist program and strategy and vision of planetary management that is dystopian. They are wrong to the degree that they reject the reality of climate crisis. And the left is completely ceded, given away that ideological struggle to the populist right.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that breakdown. Kind of shifting gears slightly a bit. In your critique of bourgeois naturalism, you problematize the ruling ideological imperial frames of man and nature, how early civilizing projects, and I'm quoting here, forced these ontogenetically separated, hierarchically structured ideological zones, end quote, in the form of the ruling binary of man and nature. You write further, and I'm quoting here again, enlightened civilizers bore the moral responsibility of rational oversight and active management. The result was to depoliticize and therefore legitimate capitalism by banishing its antagonisms onto the ground of natural law. Man, nature, and civilization became guiding threads for the practical violence of imperialism in its drive to establish the necessary conditions of world accumulation. The problem of ontological dualism institutionalized in the two cultures of the human and physical sciences is soaked in the blood and dirt of imperialist conquest and the worldwide patterns of racialized and gender class formation it created. And you continue by saying, I'm quoting here again, upon the discovery of new lands and among the first acts of every great imperial power was to declare the inhabitants as savages, unchristian, uncivilized, undevelopment, and unsustainable. They were part of nature, not human or not quite human or not yet human. A savage meant unruly and lazy, an ideological move that naturally justified work as the road to salvation. Sometimes there were debates. The Valladolid controversy was only the most salient, but the dominant tendency won out. Imperialism and world-class formation would unfold through a cultural logic of human sacrifice that entwined the ideological and the biological, end quote. So yeah, I would just love for you to discuss the connection between bourgeois naturalism, the climate crisis, and the ramifications for eco-socialism generally.
Well, it's fascinating that after so much attention to questions of race and gender, hardly anyone pays attention to the fundamental historical reality that racial and gender formation in the modern world are cultivated in the soil of naturalism. And there's a strange kind of disconnect that goes on. So as Marxists, we need to ask historical questions about the sources of that disconnect and then follow through the ideological stakes of the game. That the passage that you read is part of a longer and more protracted set of objections and critiques of the kind of what I call a woke clash of civilizations discourse that is hegemonic now on the left, where race and gender are presented as these kind of fundamental ontological categories, existential categories that really don't have a history. Sometimes people will cite Federici because she's written a great book, Caliban and the Witch, which was about 2 decades ago. What's surprising to me is that nobody takes Federici seriously. Nobody understands that Federici's wisecrack that women became the savages of Europe is about showing the ideological power of naturalism. Now, most eco-socialists, most leftists worship nature. They take nature as an innocent term that is an innocent and value-neutral description of the birds and the bees and the forests and the fields and the soils and the streams and how great it is to get out in nature and all that fun stuff. But nature is the most violent ideological category in the history of the modern world. Whenever you find authoritarian rule and authoritarian class rule, let's be clear, because the point of naturalism is to turn a profit, and the point of racism is to turn a profit, and the point of sexism is to turn a profit, either directly or indirectly in all those cases, either to justify the suppression of wages in a classic superexploitation theory, or to divide and conquer, or, as I've argued, another form of social superexploitation is to seize upon, for instance, female biological capacities to make children and create a particular ideology of nature around that, which is then translated into ideology, etc. So if you wonder why I might sound somewhat alarmed about climate emergency rhetoric, it's because it plugs into this deeper history of imperialism, authoritarianism, and the creation of these categories of social rule rooted in nature. And this is why theories like intersectionality are absolutely doing the work of neoliberalism. They're an expression of what Nancy Fraser calls progressive neoliberalism. And we want to take that very seriously because these are not free-floating forms of oppression that just somehow coalesce in different configurations. These are, if anything, a historical sequence of events. That phrasing, that I forget who quoted me, but the climate class divide, climate apartheid, climate patriarchy, these are not the results of climate crisis today, but its causes. These were formed in a very specific historical sequence during the greatest climate crisis of the past 8,000 years, the long, cold 17th century, roughly between 1550 and 1700. This was partly driven by the genocides in the New World, which, by the way, weren't because bad whitey hated indigenous peoples. It was because the empires were financed by bankers and they needed labor. And so it was driven by slaving projects, labor recruitment projects. And it was in this era that everything significant about capitalism comes together. It's remarkable to me that there are actually a lot of Marxists who think proletarianization is something that occurred right around the year 1800. And this is not only not the reality. There's a deep historical scholarship on these questions, and this was Marx's own point that proletarianization begins in the 16th century, and this was all part of a transatlantic climate-fixing dynamic to resolve the crisis of capitalism, which was a climate class nexus of revolt. And I'll pause here in just a second, but let me remind everyone, and this may be news if you're hearing it for the first time, that moments of extremely unfavorable climate in the history of civilization have been moments of social revolt, popular uprisings. In the crisis of feudalism during the 14th century, Europe's ruling classes were defeated. Now, they weren't overthrown, but they were defeated precisely in an era of climate crisis. And this happens again and again and again. It happened at the end between 1550 and 1700, happened again during Malthus's time, and it's happening again now. That is the 2010s as the unprecedented sort of culmination of a climate class world historical dynamic of contradictions all coming together in the 2010s. It was stopped dead in its tracks by the pandemic lockdowns, and it's now coming back in forms that it remains to be seen where they're headed.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned Federici, so I wanted to get into that a bit. But you talk about the ideological binary of man versus nature and how it maintains a steady relevance in articulating the climate crisis, how the quote-unquote long, cold 17th century, which you describe as the coldest period of the Little Ice Age and the coldest era of the past 8,000 years, and how this was, and I'm quoting here at length, largely the result of natural forcing. This long cold century was amplified by the slave-induced genocides of the New World, an event that hothoused the transatlantic slave trade and manifold forms of proletarianization from the Andes to the English countryside, end quote. So this era saw simultaneously violently gendered primitive accumulation across Western Europe, which Silvio Federici has infamously documented in her 2004 book, Caliban and the Witch. So for one, I would just love to hear you elaborate on this because there are a few mainstream sources that explicitly discuss climate crisis historically rather than as it is seen as something that is relatively modern and or something to be warned about for the future that is yet to come or have consequences for. But there was an intensified climate crisis in the 17th century, which imperial bourgeoisies, as you mentioned, actively sought a fix for. So can you discuss this a bit and maybe speak a bit about the gendered aspects of this in relation to Europe, as you reference, again, Federici quite a few times?
Absolutely. And let's talk about Federici first. Federici is fantastic, and I've sung her praises many times. hardly anyone takes her seriously. They read her and they celebrate her. But Federici's point in Caliban in The Witch is that the creation of modern gender relations, she doesn't pinpoint the climate moment, but that's okay. I didn't fully understand and appreciate the climate moment until really the past decade. Caliban in The Witch comes from 2004. But we can understand that what she is identifying is the creation of modern gendered binaries as a strategy of cheap work. She doesn't use that, but she comes very, very close to it because, of course, she comes out of the autonomous tradition and the Midnight Notes Collective, which is an extraordinary resource if you haven't come across it, associated with people like George Kafensis, Barry Cleaver, and many other brilliant comrades. So this was basically an intervention on Federici's part to reveal that the invention of modern man-woman binaries as tightly policed was intimately tied to the production of labor power and the labor demands of the era. In other words, the creation of gender is a class struggle. Once we put in the question of climate crisis, we begin to understand that better, that it's a class struggle in the web of life. And when she evokes the language of women as the savages of Europe, she doesn't mean that woman is a pre-existing social category in the way that we understand it. This is now the shorthand on the left, and it's deeply corrosive, that there are class categories and then gender and race categories. This is what somebody like Bellamy Foster does when he invokes the environmental proletariat, which is a totally anti-orthodox Marxist approach, and he should just be upfront and honest, but it's this sort of promiscuous commingling of intersectionality with class theory, when in fact what Federici and other anti-imperialist Marxists like Wallerstein and many others have insisted for a long time is that bourgeois and proletarian assume manifold, concrete, specific expressions that have to be wrestled with. So in the long, cold 17th century, which goes through several phases, there are signs of a climate downturn in the 1550s, which is at the same time as a massive financial crisis after the great warring powers of the Valois in France and the Habsburgs in Spain had basically bankrupted themselves, and the bankers wouldn't loan them any more money. So Philip II becomes king of Spain, and he's like, oh, shit, where am I going to get the money to fight my wars? Well, we're going to go to the Andes. This is the story of American silver, of Potosi, and one of the first great imperial proletarian projects where the empire is serving the whole of the Andes and setting up a labor draft system where workers are drawn from the villages and they're paid a nominal wage in order to keep the silver mines running. There's widespread landscape transformation, deforestation, all of these dynamics. This is part of the climate fix of the era. The climate crisis becomes worse and worse. And the social revolt, the social ferment, and the political divisions within ruling classes deepen. So an era that begins with audacious productivist and imperialist revolutions in the Low Countries, places like the Dutch Republic or the soon-to-be Dutch Republic, northeastern Brazil with sugar plantations, the colonial silver mines of Peru. It ends or it culminates in ruinous war, that's the 30 Years' War, and then in situations like we find in England in the middle of the 17th century. Cromwell is sitting in London, having cut off the head of the English king, and has a communist army, then called communist, like the commons, communist, a communist army outside of London, and he's wondering, what do I do? Well, of course, send them to Ireland to go effect another wave of quasi-genocidal ethnic cleansing, and then ship the victims of that off to the plantations, the plantation colonies of the Caribbean and North America. So we begin to see in that little vignette all of these elements of class struggle, of climate change, of political crisis, and with the Federici story, the use of nature to create gendered categories. And of course, by 1570s, as a result of this climate fix, you mentioned, Josh, the birth of the transatlantic slave trade. What you see between 1570 and 1700 is gradually, but increasingly fast towards the end of this period, the formation of racial codes, of racial categories that are once again rooted in what? In natural law, in nature. This is what is extraordinary. Like, this history is not even contested, but as some listeners may know, eco-socialists have denounced me for pointing this out and essentially said, well, you're just dealing with social constructions. Well, is that not in part how capitalism works? And is that not the essence of the problem of modern racism and sexism? They are social constructions that are fundamental. They are ideological constructions fundamental to how capitalism works and to the tasks of a socialist movement. So you mentioned bourgeois nationalism, and I see this celebrated everywhere. Fanon is often trotted out in support of bourgeois nationalism. Fanon was probably his era's greatest critic of bourgeois nationalism and of the intellectuals who supported it. And it's extraordinary to see intellectuals, apparently with no shame, using Fanon to justify racialist arguments.
Yeah, speaking of like that, the racialism point, I'm really fascinated by your claim that transhistoric racialism thesis, which I'm assuming you attributed to Cedric Robinson.
We should complicate that as we go forward, but keep going.
Okay. But yeah, so this transhistoric racialism thesis being historically untenable and politically dangerous, you write. And on First Info Post, I'm inclined to disagree with you on this, despite having my reservations and disagreements with some of Robinson's formulations. I just don't know if I can agree with the idea that Robinson's thesis reinforces racialism's petty bourgeoisie and divide and rule tendencies, end quote. Because I do not believe Robinson was historicizing from a place of racial liberalism, which obviously, as a Black African scientific socialist myself, I actively and ruthlessly critique. But to me, my read on Black Marxism is that he was attempting to expose how forms of racial regimes emerged in Europe and how the reminiscences of such paved the way for that of which would be mobilized in the moral, intellectual, ideological, and political justification for the slaughter of indigenous peoples, trafficking and racial slavery, or racial chattel enslavement of Africans, and continues to be the governing logic of Western civilization and its colonial imperialist exports. So I'm thinking of Alana Linton, for example, writing that, and I'm quoting here, race does not originate in 19th century biological theorizations, but is, as Bernard Heath explains, colonially assembled over a period of time, which goes back at least to the 15th century, end quote. And this is where I think Robinson was coming from in its magnum opus. So I'm just curious if you have any further thoughts on this.
Oh, absolutely. So Robinson's Black Marxism in my book is a brilliant mess. And that I know that it's celebrated as somehow this masterpiece, but I find much of it contradictory, to put it nicely. That does not mean, and let me underline this in full solidarity with your comments, that there aren't very important elements in there, which I cite very favorably in a series of essays that I've written. That Robinson, for instance, is at pains to emphasize that race is not about skin color. And he highlights several crucial junctures, the designation of the Irish as a racial category, which is and so that's hugely significant. Robinson provides no evidence for his central claim, this is the transhistoric moment, that racialism comes out of anti-Slavism. Anti-Slavism is a real thing, but it forms much later than he supposes. People take that argument at face value, I think, because they haven't looked at the medieval history of the famous drive to the east of Germanic peoples, which does not give rise to the kind of binarized anti-Slavism. It resembles more the fluid relations of civilized and barbarian that we find in late antiquity, for instance, with the Romans. So I believe that was the root of my assessment, drawing on Bill Robinson and his comrades' term, which is transhistoric racialism. And I think that many of the readings of Robinson, in fact, reveal a transhistoric racialism. The reference to the late 15th century can only be a reference to blood purity laws that were used to regulate Jewish populations. And that is a real lineage. So Marx has is always reminding us that previous modes of production are then find their elements expressed in the new era of capitalism or in new phases of capitalism, that these older, they're not archaic, but if you will, archaic or older cultural, political, legal forms are then reinvented and find new expression within a new mode of production. Of course, slavery is a classic example of this, that capitalism resurrects an ancient form of labor mobilization from especially the Roman West, but many other places around the world, and subjects that labor regime to an entirely different logic. The logic is, as Orlando Patterson says, of social death, of the expulsion from society. So I think those are the two sources of my objection to Robinson, who doesn't cite anyone on these questions. These are simply, or I can't even, if he does, it's a very, very thin bibliographic apparatus that doesn't invalidate his many useful points. However, to sort of paint the story of modern racism as buried deep down in the heart of medieval Europe and its anti-Slavism is, on a historical basis, entirely questionable. If people want to push back and show me that history, I spent a huge amount of my life looking at medieval Europe for some reason, because I think it does actually provide us with crucial insight into this period. And it also, that line of argument excuses capitalism from the invention of a very, very specific form of racialism grounded in nature. I mean, that's the conceit of racialist thought, right? That race is a biological category, so therefore something that we just need to adjust to scientifically. That's the bourgeois view. And it comes out of that naturalist tradition. So I think those would be my specific points, rather than indulging in any wholesale dismissal of Robinson, which I absolutely don't do.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that response, because I think there's something you said about there being disagreement, rather, with the source material in and of itself, and also how he positions it, which I honestly, personally, have like my own reservations about it. But I do think it's fascinating generally, because I think a lot of people's interpretation is that he's making a, rather than saying that it's a direct origin, but actually saying that this is, that you can see the roots of it somehow. You see how they came to this conclusion. Does that make sense? How they came to this modern or contemporary conclusion, if you study that, you know what I'm saying, go back to the 15th century, if that makes sense.
So it's also curious because the strong point would be the crusading experience against the Islamic world. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times people to draw that forward, that would be misleading, but there's clearly, in that era of high feudalism, a very well-articulated class society against another, there are elements of a move towards binarization that then come out in and perhaps this is where the scholar you cited mentions the late 15th century. Of course, 1492 is also when Islamic peoples are being expelled, and then later the Jews are being expelled. So there are ways in which, as capitalism really matures, it takes on certain elements of a crusading holy war approach. So I think that would be one way to make that general point much more compelling.
No, yeah, definitely.